Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Ilham. My name is Amadou. I'm an intern currently working here. I'm very pleased to introduce today's talk about Kalā Kulo, a Kathmandu-based collective. Its work focus on nurturing the flows and frictions of labor, working across diverse fields and frameworks of knowledge. The team explores materials and modalities of remembering and recalling. Here to tell us about the teams and the collective work are two of the team members, Priyankar Chand, a curator, researcher, and founding member of the Kalā Kulo collective, and Bishal Yonjan, a curator and visual artist. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome. Priyankar and Bishal, over to you.
Thank you. Starting with thank you to Ilham Gallery team and also Simon for connecting us, and also Rahil for having us here. It's amazing to be here at this space. I'm Bishal Yonjan. I am based in Kathmandu. I'm supposedly a visual artist, but I think, except for making art, I've been doing everything around the arts. I've been working with Kalā Kulo for past 3 years now. Kalā Kulo, it's a collective space, again based in Lalitpur in Kathmandu. For me especially, it's always kind of difficult to talk about what Kalā Kulo is, as it does so many different things and takes different shapes. So I always refer to the name itself, like how it reflects what sort of things we do or what we aspire to be. Is the Kalā Kulo. Kalā Kulo is Kala is art, and Kulo, it refers to this irrigation canal that provides water to the farmlands. So in our sense, Kalā Kulo, we do not want to exist as a center or collection, but become a channel, a sort of a system that provides all these resources to the arts and arts community and artists. The ideation of this space sort of emerged out of this necessity to have this system where a lot of institution lacks back in Kathmandu and Nepal. Priyankar.
Yeah, thanks Bishal. I'm Priyankar. Thank you everyone for coming on a Saturday morning. I don't know if it's common in Malaysia. In Nepal, people would be very tired after partying on Friday, but we also only have a one-day weekend, but we have 53 public holidays, so, so it makes up for it. But it's really nice to be here and sort of talk about these different connections we've had. And there's something we've been meaning to do for a while as well, to have conversations across different spaces in Asia to think about how we're connected, how we can think about practices and modes of knowledge production together. When we founded Kalā Kulo, this was around the time of COVID. I think it came with a sense of urgency to think about a lot of materials and people who are actually dying. A lot of senior artists in Nepal were dying, and there's not necessarily any institutional framework to either preserve, contextualize, or document their practices. So we sort of stepped in and were working with a lot of archives of elder Nepali artists. And I think to frame sort of the conversation today, we eventually realized like this was a lot of burden to put on ourselves as well. And there was a lot of work to do. And then we realized I think the whole apparatus of archiving is quite heavy. And we're using the term unarchiving also as a sense to think about how to unravel, how to open, and also how to have conversations about these materials in a way that sort of expands it rather than just trying to catalog and like document all of the things we're seeing. I think today over the course of this presentation we'll touch upon sort of 3 chapters of what we've been doing over the course of the past 3 years. The initial looks at a collection of modernist artists in Nepal who are working after 1950s. The second section sort of looks at practices of tattooing across Nepal and also the India border that Nepal shares. And then the third section deals with works of Nepali artists who we're collaborating with that deal with migration and themes of dislocation and identity. And hopefully some of these artworks will get to bring in Ilham next year. So yeah, and I think starting with the next slide, when we're looking at modernism in Nepal, it's slightly complicated because one, we didn't share the same colonial history as the rest of South Asia or the rest of Asia, where Nepal was sort of like a buffer state between what is then the Tibetan Empire as well as the British Raj. And then in that period, there's a few introduction of European painting styles in Nepal, but it's only after the 1950s where Nepal sort of formally opens its borders to the rest of the world. A lot of Nepalis go to study across Asia, also to China, also to Russia, but primarily in India, so places like Calcutta, Bombay, Lucknow, and Delhi. And then they come back to Kathmandu and sort of start this new movement of artistic practices. But this movement is shared across different productions of art in Kathmandu, so literature, music, and the visual arts as well, and architecture too. So we're looking at this generation of artists who came at this period. A lot of them actually migrated from India back to Kathmandu and then started working in various capacities.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, for one of the archive here is the collection of Tegbir Mukhia. He was born in Darjeeling, a village near Darjeeling in India, and then worked through different design studios in Calcutta. I mean, he didn't have like a formal art background, formal art education background, but I mean, in some ways he taught himself to work through with designs and visual arts. And then he came back to Nepal in around 1965 in the same flow of migration that sort of where a lot of people from Nepali diasporic communities were coming back to the country. Even the government itself was sort of going to these diasporic communities and inviting them to come back to Nepal and work, as the government was also working towards this idea of modern nation building. And in the same flow of migration, Tegbir Mukhia was one of the people who came back to Kathmandu and started working at this publication house called Saza Prakashan, for 40 plus years, where he designed book covers. And Saza Prakashan, the publication house, it's a public-private entity with supported through government funding. I mean, the publication house is no longer as active as it used to be, but it did play a huge role back in 60s, 70s, and 80s, as people didn't have access to publication before that. It was very restricted access to publication, and a lot of writers and people who wanted to publish often used to travel to India, to different places like Banaras and Kolkata to get their books published or writings published. With Saza publication in place, people could actually get their things published in Nepal, in Kathmandu. And I think it also sort of helped to shape the modern literature in Nepal, with a lot of modern writers coming to Kathmandu, and writers like Parizad, Indra Bahadur Rai, and then Bhupi Sharchan, who were also from the regional places, from Darjeeling especially, then came back to Nepal and started publishing their modern writings. And eventually all these book covers books would go to Tegbir Mukhia for designing, because he was the only chief designer in the publication house. And that's how I think his connection sort of started with all these modern literatures and all. I mean, along with that, I think my interest and our interest also lies in looking at the design history and also looking at the print history itself. how Tegbe Mukhi, I mean, as a designer, he would often have to adapt to the limitations of the printing, starting with like block printings, and then slowly the transformation into offset printings. And I think you can also find like him using digital tools in the designs of early 2000s. And that sort of informed us about the transformation of printing history, along with how designers adapted to the printing machines and technologies and how they were evolving itself.
I mean, to add to that, I think Tegbirji was also, a lot of these designs were handmade during that time, so even the lettering, the drawings, and when we approached him, he said he burnt all of his originals because no one considered it to be art. So he's like, oh, I didn't have storage in my house. And in his estimate, he designed 5,000 book covers in his life. We have around 700 in our collection so far. And we go to like secondhand bookstores, people's like personal libraries, book fairs in Kathmandu, and every time we travel, and it's really nice because like at least he signed most of the book covers with this little like his the initials of his surname, which is MU, so Mu, but he would usually do it in like the Devanagari, the script we used in Nepal. So in corners of these like book covers, you'll see his signature. So we've sort of been using that signature to trace a lot of his works. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also alongside like publication house, all these big institutions, he was also working with independent writers, independent publishers. In the middle section, you see the series of books. Those are more like a pulp fiction set of books which were circulated under, we believe it's a pseudonym, Yudir Thapa. And I mean, these are not the books that were, like being sold in like big bookshops, but more like underground circulated or like sold on the side of the streets by the small bookshops. And then yeah, these were sort of other sort of involvements the Tegbe Mukhi was also working on, along with the institution. And then for these sort of books, he would have completely different aesthetics to the covers than how he used to design book covers for the Saza publication house, using more of these magazine cutouts, Bollywood movie posters, different kind of color approach. Yeah, and on the right, you can see the portraits. That's the artist himself. It's a magazine called Rachana. And it came out in the time when a lot of, the Nepali modern artist scene was also experimenting with pop culture, and then this self-portraits. And then I think that this is how the Tegbe Mukhi as a designer was also sort of bringing those ideas into his book covers. And on the left, those are some of the images from his collection with writers and his contemporary visual artists. And this is another artist's collection that we've been sort of working to document and archive. It's the archive of Silu Pyari. She was trained in India in fine arts and economics. Unfortunately, she's no longer with us. She passed away quite early in her age. But there are like certain collections, and we've been talking in conversation with her family to sort of help organize and manage all these archives and collections. Even though like Silu Pyari herself didn't have like a much longer life as an artist, but she was involved in a lot of institution building in Nepal, being member of various institutions, being the first commissioner to represent 5 Nepali artists in first India Triennale, and also she was also a member of parliament for certain years. And then I think one of the interesting things for us was to look at how these sort of archival material or this collection were coming to us. Was like the the family members would often send these images through WhatsApps and all these details through WhatsApps. And we would find these tiny photographs of Silupari and all the still life drawings he did back in our college in a tiny metal box. And that sort of gave us a window to look at like how these materials were being in some way circulated, or like how it was being passed on.
And the other reason why we were particularly interested in this collection, and one of our other members, Deepthi Sharchan, she's doing her PhD on many things around modernism in Nepal, but one particular section of her work deals with women artists from that time and sort of the different ways in which they were precluded from continuing their careers as well. For example, a lot of Nepali artists now don't even know who Shilupyari is, or if there was an artist who was called Shilupyari. And she's someone who like led a bunch of the institutions that, you know, sort of formalized modernism in Nepal, and yet the institutions that survived thereafter don't necessarily continue or preserve this memory. And it's not just Shilupyari, but there are a series of other women artists also who were looking into and sort of trying to figure out and contextualize their careers and practices. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other collection that we've been working for the past 1 year is the collection of artist Lansing Bangdel. I mean, he's also looked at some sort of founding figure of the modern art in Nepal, because I mean, he was born in Darjeeling again, and then trained in Kolkata, but then moved to London and Paris for his study in art, and then came back to Nepal and worked through various institutions as chancellor, as members. He was also a chancellor of Royal Nepal Academy for like 10 years, and then also helped set up a lot of other institutions such as Nepal Art Council and other institutions. And I mean, for me personally, working with the archive was, the interesting thing was like, back in my college days, I would often hear about the paintings of Lansing Bangdel and the modernism in his paintings, but with the archive and with the volume of archive, which is around like 10,000 materials, and I mean, we've only been able to sort of digitize and work with like around 1,200 materials so far. But still, looking at those 1,200 materials, there's so many of writings, published and unpublished writings, writings about like his research on sculptures of Nepal, ancient sculptures of Nepal, and mostly writings about modern art, his contemporary artist, and the Asian art sort of thing. Which was fascinating for me to see all those writings coming from an artist, and also like the amount of these different materials of photographs, slides, and negatives, which are almost in the count of thousands, which we haven't even touched yet. And then he also has like a series of these diaries that he would have like for each of his travel, which also informs of us like the places that he's been to, and then how he was able to manage to sort of travel to different places at that time. Yeah, and only last month we had, we sort of concluded the archival project with a symposium talking about the archival practices, modernity, modernism in Nepal, and also archival practices not in just institutional places, but what does the archival practices look in more of an individual approach or individual practice research. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that also helps us transition into the next sort of lot of works we want to talk about. And this particularly deals with, I think, like two members of our collective space, Hitman Gurung and Shilasha Rajbhandari, are a part of an artist collective in Nepal called Artree Nepal. There are 5 indigenous artists from different communities in Nepal who've been active for more than a decade now, thinking very deeply about what indigeneity, identity, and politics means in our context. And through their sort of ongoing practice and their inquiry, and in collaboration with the Arti Nepal collective, Kalā Kulo was also thinking about different ways in which we can sort of think about archives, different type of practices that archive in different ways. And I think through our individual research, we are looking into tattooing practices across South Asia. Tattooing in South Asia is known by the terms Godana and Tika in particular. And we are fascinated sort of with this practice that, I mean, it requires the body in order to be transmitted. It's a very embodied practice, and it's quite difficult to just like take pictures and archive it. Over here is sort of, this is by artist Lavkan Chaudhary. These are motifs of different, different things made in tattooing in Nepal. And I think similar to tattooing practices across Asia, actually, even in Nepal, there's a spiritual belief that any image that is made during tattooing can be transferred into the afterlife. So you can take these materials with you even after death. The techniques are different between Southeast Asia and, I guess, this part of South Asia, where we have more of a hand poke method where you tie needles and directly perforate the skin. There is no stick or bamboo or other implement used to tie the needle in to then tap and make tattoos. So I think that would be the difference regionally in terms of how we do it. But when we started the project, it kind of took this very ethnographic approach of like, you know, you just go and ask people, how do you tattoo? How do you make ink? And then, or how did you learn? I think the one question we'd ask a lot to these grandmothers. And in the context of South Asia at large, tattooing is a practice made by women for women. There are certain instances in which men receive tattoos and make it, but it's quite sporadic. But we did record those instances as well. But when you're speaking to a lot of these grandmothers, and tattooing now is a very declining practice, so a lot of these images hadn't been made for almost 4 or 5 decades, and it's only the grandparents of many like villages that remember how these practices were done or continued. And we'd go and ask, okay, how did you learn how to tattoo? And they would just respond by saying, what do you mean, how did I learn? I just know how to tattoo. This is something I picked up in my village, like what do you mean by learn? And I think then we realized we had to do shift like how we sort of were wanting to study it, but also this way we realized is like, I don't know, when you try to archive, there's this colonial dimension of trying to know, like, we want to know everything, we want to know this, we want to know that, we want to take a picture of each motif, try to define what it is, and we're like, no, this is not a helpful approach. And then we had to sit and sort of rethink it. Over here you have images of like how ink is prepared for tattooing, generally speaking. Over there you have like a lamp. In this case it's kerosene, but traditionally mustard oil would have also been used. So you can also use different type of oils. Sometimes people use like, what is it, like battery ink? But the soot is collected and then the soot is scraped, and here you have like a portable hookah with a coconut, and then you sort of pour the water out of the hookah and then you prepare your ink to then tattoo. And yeah, so these are Jagmati and Subhasini Chaudhary. Many of the artists who we speak with also belong to the indigenous Tharu community in Nepal. So there's a large community of around more than 1.5 million peoples actually living alongside the Nepal-India border. And in this project, we are working very closely with Tharu artists, Lavkan Chaudhary and Indu Tharu. And we'll show you a little video where they sort of feature and speak about how this project sort of unfolded. But in the course of our work, we were introduced to Subhasini and Jagmati Chaudhary, and they are a tattooing duo. So they practice this together, which is also quite unique. And we realized instead of trying to document all of this, we needed to create a space in which they can just tattoo and sort of show us what they were talking to us about. And Lavkan kindly volunteered his leg for this scene. I mean, it'll be pictured in the video. But yeah, and it's really interesting because they kept on whispering different things as they were tattooing. And then we realized, oh, they're talking about far more things, and there's so much depth to these conversations than when we were just trying to like ask a straightforward question and response type of format. Next door. And I think through like these more like individual conversations, we also realized we were speaking to around a dozen or so grandmothers across like 10 villages in southern Nepal. And then we realized it's kind of pointless for us to talk to them. We need them to talk to each other, which also had never happened before. So we kind of did this gathering that we called Tika Chedna Angana, which I guess we translate as like a garden of body markings, because traditionally tattooing would have been done in the outdoors, usually in one's garden space in Nepal. And yeah, so we got a bunch of grandmothers together to sort of, they were speaking to, I mean, we sort of gave them the tools, but like they're sort of speaking to each other about how tattooing was practiced in their respective villages, and it was really informative and kind of heartwarming to see them connect with each other too. Then Bishal's kindly volunteering his hand up there. In the previous slides, you saw his hand working with archives, and now he's volunteering his hand for a tattoo, but yeah. Thank you, Bishal. And these are all the grandmothers we are working with over the course of the project, who come from many different villages, also speak around 4 different languages, but they're still able to communicate with each other for this project. And it was quite, and I think it gave a lot of pathways into try to think about, okay, how do you actually provide a space for people to speak about this? But this also opened the opportunity for many artists in Nepal, including Lavkant and Indu, who are contemporary artists in their own right, to figure out how they want to continue tattooing as a practice and what they would like to pick up and learn from it. So it opened a lot of new windows into thinking about what this practice means and sort of the directions it can take. Video? Okay, we'll show you a brief video that kind of deals with these themes.
खोजले जियर नहीं पैबो हो सामी नपाकी झापाकी कोया अब मेरो आमाले आफै टिका ल्याउनुहुन्थ्यो, टिका छोड्नुहुन्थ्यो। धेरै महिला दिदीबहिनीहरू चाहिँ आउनुहुन्थ्यो मेरो घरमा, र त्यो टिका छोड्न आउँदाखेरि चाहिँ टिका छोड्ने व्यक्तिलाई चाहिँ एकदमै सम्मान गर्ने त्यो चाहिँ थियो, चलन थियो। र त्यो खुट्टा रङ्गाउनलाई मात्रै गर्नुहुन्छ, त्यो अर्थ, त्यो टिकाको त्यो बुट्टाहरू चित्रहरू चाहिँ के को लागि त्यस्तो केही पनि थाहा थिएन। र जब मेरो आमा चाहिँ पछि थारू भन्दा पनि अरू समुदायको ड्रेस लाउन थाल्नुभयो, ड्रेस लाउँदा मेरो आमा चाहिँ पहिलेदेखि चाहिँ नेता रहेको हुन्थ्यो। अनि आन्दोलनमा हिँडिराख्दाखेरि त्यसो ड्रेस लाउँदाखेरि खुट्टा यसरी गराएपछि सबैजना मेरो टिका हेरिदिन्छन्, हेर्छन् मेरो टिकाहरू, लाज लाग्छ भन्नुहुन्थ्यो कि। अनि मैले चाहिँ एक्चुअली सोधेको थिएँ आमालाई, त्यस्तो लाज लाग्ने खालको त केही पनि देख्दैन, त्यहाँ त हरेक कुराहरू देखिरहेको हुन्छु, त्यो चित्रहरू छ, थारू समुदायले बोल्ने भाषासँग जोडेको, संस्कृतिसँग जोडेका कुराहरू पनि छन् भनेर सोधेको थिएँ।
ठीक है, आप नहीं देखते सीख रही, पहला मैंने बताई ना, इसलिए सीख गया, टीका छत्ती कर गया, बस चलिए दोस्त आ गया। पढ़ाने की छेड़ और भी अभी कैसी पढ़ाने की छेड़ इतना बस बड़ा सिखा देंगे हमें क्या उसका कर देगा बस सिखा देंगे छेड़
अनि भगवान मक्खर देखेंगे ये बड़े टीका छेड़ से कहेंगे
तब तो टीके नहीं कहें गंगा गुड़िया तो कायला भी कहते टीका के साथ है जाते टीके में छेड़ जाते तब ना तो भाटी के खा भगवान घर जाके चूल्ही बना ले हंसिया बना ले जनो भगवान का जो मुझे हंसिया कहाँ पे वो बटला कहाँ पे वो चूल्हा कहाँ पे वो ना तब वह जस्ते बनाए जस्ते
हामी महिलाहरूले बनाउने टिकाको बुट्टाहरू हेऱ्यो भने प्रकृतिसँग एकदमै निकट सम्बन्ध रहेको देखिन्छ। जस्तो अब विभिन्न जनावरहरूको चित्र बनायो त्यहाँ, घोडा बनायो, मजुर बनायो त्यहाँ। यो कुराहरू हेर्दाखेरि चाहिँ एकदमै प्रकृति प्रेमी र त्यो यो प्रकृतिमा पाउने जीवजन्तुलाई या वस्तुहरूलाई चाहिँ कसरी आफ्नो शरीरमा पनि फुक्न सकिन्छ होइन। यो चाहिँ मलाई चाहिँ कस्तो लाग्छ भने यो प्रकृतिसँगको सम्बन्ध भन्ने कुरा अब हाम्रो वस्तुसँग मात्रै भएन, हाम्रो जिउमै भयो र हाम्रो छालामै त्यो कुरा कोरियो कि
लगभग क्यों तभी मालूम ठीक है पता है ये अस्ति जस्तै बनाउनु बस्दै सिधै त्यहाँ पल्ले बना गाड़ी बेटी कष्ट के बदल छिड़े नहीं आप बुला के ये थे हमरे के घर की कथा बनाए नष्ट के करना पे कद से बड़ी छलना की दिन के छलना पाल कब वो पछना कब वो छलना आप जो दिन फिर छुगेल का वो आवश्यक चीज कराने
यो टीका छेड्न जुन ज्ञान र सिप थियो मेरो आमाको त्यो मसँग नआउनुमा म मात्रै जिम्मेवार छैन, मेरो आमा मात्रै जिम्मेवार हुनुहुन्न होइन। हाम्रो राज्य सत्ताले हामी आदिवासीहरूलाई हेर्ने दृष्टिकोण आदिवासीहरूको ज्ञान र सिप नै होइन भन्ने तरिकाले होइन। हाम्रो आमाले पनि त्यो प्रशिक्षण किन दिनु भएन भने उहाँले त हेपिएको अनुभव छ नि त। मेरो छोरी पनि यसरी हेपिन नपरोस्, भोलि गएर ट्याटू लगायो भने फेरि त्यसलाई ढाक्न नपरोस् भन्ने त्यो भावना त मेरो आमामा छँदै रहेन। त्यस कारणले उहाँले मलाई स्थानान्तरण गर्नु भएन।
अब सायद मलाई लाग्छ अहिले धेरै हाम्रो यसको मान्छेहरू चाहिँ ट्याटू खोपिसक्नु भएको छ। म चिया नहोला, मन्जुर नहोला तर खोप्नु भएको छ। तर त्यो ट्याटूको ठाउँमा त्यो अरू चित्रको ठाउँमा चाहिँ म चिया नै खोपेको भए त हाम्रो संस्कृतिमा अझै उच्च ठाउँ जाँदै जान्थ्यो होला। यो बिचमा चाहिँ हाम्रो बुवाहरूको पछाडिको अलि पछाडिको कुरा पुस्ताहरूले चाहिँ एकदम सङ्घर्ष गरेको, दुःख गरेको, उनीहरू एकदम नेपालीमा थारू गरेको चाहिँ एकदमै हेपिएको चेपिएको जाति हो। त्यस कारणले पनि उनीहरू आफ्नो संस्कृति र आफ्नो अधिकार र पहिचानको बारेमा पनि बुझ्न पाए। जब लोकतन्त्र गणतन्त्र आइसकेपछि छाती खोलेर हो हाम्रो अधिकार यो हो, हामी चाहिँ यस्तो गर्नुपर्छ भनेर जुन आयो नि, हो बल्ल अरू मान्छे जाति।
टीका छेड़कलाई काका करे पर काका चीज चाहत के कर दिए। तो यहाँ पहले से पुरखा से टीका छेड़े जन्ना टीका छेड़कलाई काका चाहते हैं। यहाँ काका चूल्हा बा, वही दिया बा, तेल, बेसार, डोरा, सुई सब चीज़ बा वही फरक फरक परखा हमरे बना दी ना।
पहले दिया नन्दी हमने सुरमन दिया करखा बनाई दी वैसे कर तेला दिया टाने बना तब ये दिया मट्टी तेला वाला दिया बने दी। पहले चला ढ्यापरी कच्ची हमने पहले ढ्यापरी के लिए तब चिड़े वाला ढ्यापरी में तेल डाल के बस ढाल ली चूल्हा में, तब ऊपर से टावर होके खोपटे ली, तब करखा पड़ेगी, तब करखा धरेगी परा के करखा धरा के तब खोल ली। सुई एक जाने हमने सुई बनेगी बनली डोरले, एक जाने हमने करखा गोही करखा भरली मैं सुई बनू।
ये मिठो मंदिर एक बनाई मिठा कि नहीं बोलो मिठा तरन के महीना साथी तो मिठो मंदिर का मिठा ना सब पूरा बना नहीं पूरा बना त्यो टिका खोप्ने आमा टिकने आमाहरूले चाहिँ डराइराख्नु भएको थियो कि मैले टिका खोप्दाखेरि कस्तो चाँडो शरीर हो, चाँडै गर्दैन त यो नानीले त भन्नुहुन्थ्यो कि। तर मलाई चाहिँ एकदम खुसी फिल भइरहेको थियो। एउटा पुरानो पुर्खाहरूले ल्याएको त्यो रीतिलाई म जोगाउँदैछु भन्ने चाहिँ मलाई एकदमै गर्व फिल भइरहेको थियो। र दुखाइले पनि सुरुमा अलिअलि दुखाइ लाग्यो, तर त्यसपछि त केही दुखाइ लागेन। दोस्रो दिन खुट्टा सुन्नेर यति मोटो भएको थियो र पनि मैले मजाले लिएर हिँडिरहेको थिएँ कि दुखाइ नै मानेन, ज्वरो पनि आयो होइन। पछि आउँछ यो त मान्छे छालाको जान्छ जुइठो ज्वार बाट्न मन्दिर हुन्छ कसी काट्नु तेल प्याकेटहरू लगाएर अझ आउँछ 2-3 दिनमा आउँछ यो भित्र यो छाला निस्किन्छ नि भित्रैदेखि आउँछ
यो कार्यक्रमको सबैभन्दा ठुलो सफलता त जो टीका छेड्न जान्ने र जसको जिउमा टीका छेडिएको छ उहाँहरूको बिचको अन्तर्क्रिया उहाँहरूको जुन ज्ञान र सिप छ हैन त्यो ज्ञान र सिप उहाँहरू बिचमा मात्रै सीमित थियो त्यो कुरा चाहिँ बाहिर आयो हैन त्यसलाई चाहिँ हामीले यसरी सामूहिक रूपमा टीका छेड्ने कार्यक्रम चाहिँ अहिलेसम्म मलाई लाग्छ हाम्रो इतिहासमै कहिले भएको थिएन तर त्यतिमा मात्रै पनि सीमित नभएर नयाँ पुस्तालाई टीका छेड्नको बारेमा कसरी थाहा दिने भन्नको लागि चाहिँ त्यहाँ सानो थारू टीका छेड्ना या ट्याटु एक्जिबिसन फोटोसहितको त्यो पनि गरिएको थियो नयाँ जेनेरेसनको स्कुल पढ्ने विद्यार्थीहरूलाई शिक्षकहरूलाई युवाहरूलाई ल्याएर हामीले त्यो कार्यक्रमको बारेमा जानकारी दियौँ त्यो पनि ठुलो सफलता हो यो टीका छेड्न जान्ने टिप्नियाहरू जो हुनुहुन्छ उहाँहरू एउटा बाँचिरहेको इतिहास पनि हो जसले चाहिँ अहिले झन्डै लोप नै भइसकेको थारू टीका छेड्न जुन थियो त्यो झन्डै मरिसकेको अवस्थामा उहाँहरू आफ्नै जिउमा बोकेर बाँच्नु भएको छ त्यसकारण उहाँहरूलाई म जीवित इतिहासहरू हुनु भनेर भन्न चाहन्छु
But yeah, so I think after the end of all of this, Indu, who you saw at the end of the video, now she had no tattoos then, but I think now she has like, I don't know, like 5-6 tattoos, but they're quite large, some of them. And she's also learning how to tattoo. Lavkant, well, his leg was pictured there. He has a tattoo studio now in Kathmandu. It opened a few months back. So yeah, so it's sort of a process that we're supporting, that we're working with together with these artists, and we'll see where it goes. But yeah, anyway, we'll be happy to talk to any of you if you have knowledge on tattooing practices in Southeast Asia, how that unfolds here. I think the artists in Nepal would be very interested in figuring out potential links. Yeah, this sort of leads us to the final chapter of things we want to talk about, and this is particularly related to migration and mobilities between South and Southeast Asia. What's pictured here is a recent work by Hitman Gurung, who's a Nepali visual artist and curator and also a member of Kalā Kulo. What appear to be like little, I don't know, gold biscuits are actually tombstones of Gurkha soldiers from the various wars they fought in. Some of them might actually be from Malaysia as well. I think there are a few Gurkha cemeteries here. Some of them are from Singapore, some from Hong Kong, some from Britain, so from all around the world. Hitman, I mean, it's very difficult to travel with a Nepali passport, so Hitman sort of doing his online archiving of all of these tombstones and collecting them, and next slide, and sort of presenting the tombstones in conversation with different materials that he's looking into over the past 20 years or so. His artistic practice is deeply involved with migration and how migration has affected the cultural and political fabric of Nepal. And there's a migration for different things. Some of them are for labor migration that you observe in Malaysia. Some of them are for migration being involved with the British military that still continues up till this date. Some of them involve more seasonal migration between India and Nepal. And he's also trying to think about migration in a more interspecies lens, so he's also looking at birds and fish and how that compares to how humans move as well. So pictured here are sort of his different materials he's thinking through, including images from his village in Lamjung in western Nepal, lungis that reference the collection of lungis his mother has that was gifted to her over the years from people who had either migrated or worked in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong, and other images that have speculative poetry that he's working on to think through this complex history and the layers that exist there. These images are also part of the same artwork that was shown in the previous slide. This one is titled Revolutionary Dreams, and it's a part of Hitman's ongoing performative photography series, where he sort of thinks about the different histories of migrant workers from Nepal. And both of these are Hitman. Sometimes people get confused and I joke and say, no, that's Hitman's twin, and then Some people believe it, but, but both of them are Hitman. And then to the right, you see a migrant worker. That's the specific uniform, I think, of migrant workers who are particularly helping construct the different stadiums for the FIFA World Cup in Qatar. So Hitman was part of a residency in Doha, so he collected a lot of materials then and then uses it in the series of photographs. And to the left, you sort of have an image of an individual that's supposed to reference someone who was a part of the People's, what was then the People's Liberation Army of the Maoist movement in Nepal, and trying to reference the civil war that took place in Nepal from 1996 till 2006 that led to a lot of political transformations in the country, and including the end of the monarchy, the introduction of a federal democratic state, and also after this particular war, you also see a lot of Nepalis migrate to a lot of different places, including Malaysia. And yeah, so he's comparing sort of these histories and also bringing into juxtaposition the lived realities where there are some former combatants who after the war actually end up being labor migrants in different spaces across Asia, and trying to think about, well, the dreams of revolution and sort of how they fail, but also how they subject people to different forms of labor exploitation over multiple generations and periods.
Yeah, and, these works are also part of the same series from the earlier slide. Hitman is also looking at this material culture that sort of got adapted into some of the indigenous communities in Nepal, especially from like, I mean, lungis were initially came to Nepal through through Gorkha armies who were stationed in various East Asian countries like Southeast Asian countries like Myanmar, Malaysia, and Singapore, and lungis were taken back to taken back to Nepal as a souvenirs, as a gift for family members, and I mean it has gotten so adapted that it's a part of the traditional culture now. I mean, and it's pretty common between the communities like Gurung, Rai, Limbu, and somewhat in Tamang communities as well, because these are the communities from where most of these Gorkha armies were recruited from, and sort of these communities have some ways adapted to it. And the other artists that we are also in conversation or looking at is Susanna Sris. She is from Gulmi, which is the western part of the Nepal, and she comes from a Magar family. And again, like Magar communities also has like a long history of going to Gorkha army, especially men, because like it's only the men who were recruited in the Gorkha army. And I think the interesting thing about Susanna is looking at these Gorkha histories, but in perspective from the women who were, I mean, in some ways left in the village to take care of the housing and take care of the families, and who hold all these cultures. And here in the photograph, you can see on the backdrop is like the lungis that were worn by grandmothers. Susanna is talking to. Yeah, and then she also like makes portraits of the grandmothers through different archival photographs. Sometimes she photographs them, or she also looks into these different documentations that her father has started, trying to document all the people that have migrated or traveled to Gorkha army from Gulmi and other places in Nepal.
And this brings us to the last series of artworks we want to talk about. This is by artist Mek Limbu, who's also a part of the same collective as Hitman Gurung. They both have been thinking about migration together, as well as in a collective practice, but also as individual artists. The line you see there is like the line to collect passports in Kathmandu. So Hitman and Mek were traveling and documenting the line. They also collected objects that people would leave behind as they were trying to collect their passports. It's a little bit different now. I think you have to fill your form online, and I mean, it's still very complicated, but you don't see these lines anymore. But this was, I think it was like this even to the period right before COVID, yeah. And there used to be very long lines to collect one's passports, and behind that line, you kind of see classified ads for employment opportunities across particularly the UAE, Dubai, I mean UAE and Qatar and Saudi, I think, in this case. And yeah, next. And Make also was a part of the same residency as Hitman in Doha. And in that particular period, what Make also decided to do was document the life of his father, who was a who was a construction worker in Qatar for more than 2 decades, so almost all throughout Make's childhood and early adult life. Now his father is back in Nepal, but he is also sort of looking at the ramifications, the repercussion that this sort of migration has on estrangement between family members, and sort of how do you document this history that's quite difficult and that doesn't really get spoken of. To the left is sort of Make looking at his father's passport, his father's life as a construction worker, and to the right, all those dots are houses his father built in Doha. And yeah, and this next slide is an image of each of those houses that's been pinned in the earlier slide. So Make sort of traveled with his father throughout Doha, trying to document everything that he had built. And he also stayed at the, well, I guess what's called labor camps there, because there are different places that have been assigned for construction workers to stay and live, and the living conditions aren't ideal. But and you're not allowed to go there unless if you've been contracted by the company, but because Make kind of looks like everyone else, he just snuck in and was working from there for quite some time, documenting all of these realities. And yeah, and to the right is, I guess to your left, is an image of Make's father when he had just gone to Qatar initially. And then towards the right is Make and his father in Doha when he'd gone to document his father's life there. And hopefully, I mean, we can bring these works to Malaysia when we work with Ilham to put together the exhibition on migration and sort of movements that we're thinking through from the lens of Nepal. And yeah, next slide. Well, that's it from our end. Happy to take some questions. That's our social media handle. We'll post more as we work through it. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Priyankar and Bishal. So if you have any questions, I can hand you the mic so that you can talk. Any question?
Hello. Okay. Hi Priyanka. Hi Bishal. Maybe because I've also been following your progress and the development of Kalā Kulo since the pandemic, and I've been there, witnessing the exponential sort of like growth of your organization. I recall at the very beginning, it really started off as a very modest initiative at, cataloging modernist artists, right? And it stems from primarily Dipti's sort of like interest and her research, her PhD research. But how did you then very quickly decide to also pivot into like different forms of vernacular cultural expressions? And do you see any sort of like relationship and connection to, the modernist sort of like artworks that you're also cataloging? Are they in, what is the relationship between these two sort of like fields of practice? Are they simply coexisting side by side, or are they also mutually informing one another? Maybe if you can help to sort of like tease out what some of your preliminary observations are, I think it would be quite interesting for us to know. I
mean, we're also trying to figure out like how to tease out or explain that relationship. Sometimes they seem like very two distinct streams that are going their own flow, but there are points at which I think they're related to each other. I mean, while it may seem like we started off with one project and then sort of veered into another, the different members that make up our collective practice, they've been working on these thematics for over 10 years before we kind of came together and founded a space, right? So it kind of comes from, the work we do is kind of informed with what individually we're interested in, and then how we can sort of support or think about it together when the opportunity arises. So including with themes around migration and tattooing. And I think even with modernism, I guess that was the first initial point that brought us together, but we have multiple intersecting ideas and thematics that we wanted to work on eventually, and I think we've been happy that we've had the chance to sort of explore these thematics. In terms of how the archives might be related is, there were a few artists who sort of were trained outside and came to Nepal and then began questioning what art history should look like for us. And including Bangdal, I mean, he was trying to deeply think about how do you place Nepali art history and vernacular practices as a whole. I mean, even in his practice, it kind of seems very distinct. He has these, we don't have images of his artworks, but most of his works are these large abstract paintings. But for a significant period of his career, he was documenting Nepali sculptures, just photographing Nepali sculptures, a lot of which ended up being stolen over the course of the 1970s till the early 1990s. And now his works are sort of used to repatriate a lot of the sculptures that end up in auction houses or museums abroad. We actually get emails time to time from people being like, do you have an image of such and such sculpture from such and such period? And then we need to sift through the materials and kind of email it to them. There are also other artists, one of whom is Batsa Gopal Vaidya, who we work with, who comes from this long generation of healers in the Kathmandu Valley. And when we go to speak to him, I mean, he has materials from the 1950s, but some days he'll come with a sack of manuscripts from the 17th century and be like, I grew up with these, what do I do with them? And we're like, we don't know. We don't have to read them. How did it impact? And he was actually drawing on tantric images of for healing different ailments to inform his printmaking practices in the early 70s. So there are artists who are working across different time periods and trying to think about it. And I guess in a sense how we work also kind of fits into that. We're sort of collapsing multiple time periods into one when we're often working and trying to think about the messiness of that. It's not really neat, but yeah. There are some points at which it connects, but most of the time, I guess it's also because of how one, there's a stream that studies modern art history, and often the vernacular stuff usually falls into the category of anthropology even in Nepal, even though there's not a lot of material. Surprising in South Asia, there's not a lot of anthropological literature on tattooing, even though it's a very large culture and very large presence across many, throughout all of South Asia actually tattooing exists. So yeah, and we're trying to figure out what might be the best ways to speak about it, but the connections, yeah, it slowly develops and emerges for certain artists and practices, but it's also not always there. And at times, in the Bangdal archive, they do seem more distinct points of his life that he was working through that don't necessarily talk to each other neatly. And it's difficult. I mean, if you have an artist who's living, they can sort of explain these complexities, but for estates in which we don't have the artist to talk to, then it's kind of difficult for us to explicate how these distinct things might be related to each other. Thanks, Simon.
Hi. I'm curious, as an artist, how would your creative practice intervene the archival part of your activities? You've kind of invoked earlier in some of the cases how archiving itself, it's a legacy of colonial relations. You're trying to document something, but as artists, you also have to consider, for example, the affective relations between different objects. So how do you then invoke these historical sensorium apart from just documenting? For example, the turmeric that they would apply after the tattooing process. How do you incorporate these elements of experiences as an artist?
but I mean, for the different archival projects in a sense, and not all of them are termed as archiving project. I mean, for the tattooing practice in particular, I think we stopped using that term. And we never use that term, but I think we are doing some form of like documenting and archiving, but that's not the primary impetus. It depends. So for example, for the tattooing project, the people who's, I'm also not the artist in the group. I'm the guy who writes all the statements and does the accounting when I need to. But, it would be, I mean, I think the artist can explain it better, but I think, at least in terms of what I understand in conversation with the artist who led that project, and I think as a space, what we want to do is, for projects in which, like you mentioned, there are these dimensions to documenting and dimensions to thinking about these practices that go beyond mere like photographing or labeling, we kind of handed over to them. So Lovekant really sort of took the leadership of this project alongside Indu to sort of figure out, how do you even study this? And in a way that's not so, you know, intrusive, particularly for a lot of these grandmothers that we are speaking to. And I guess in the sense, like, I mean, we've known these women for over like 5-6 years now. And I think we finally came and started having these conversations last year as a whole. And in terms of trying to think about, I mean that for us in the particular case of tattooing, what we realize is that for embodied practices to continue, you sort of need spaces in which that conversation can happen. And particularly in Nepal, where tattooing wasn't even being presently practiced, for Lovekant, that was like a whole starting point of, okay, I need to start learning how to tattoo. I need to find teachers. I need to find how this was done. And this was also after, we don't have an image here, but his grandmother had this very complex chest piece. And then he wanted to go and interview his grandmother about her experiences with tattooing. This was around the time of COVID, and his grandmother actually passed away at that time. So after that, I think he decided to actually become a tattoo artist in his own right. And in that way, I think that journey itself has been like a big sort of call for him, as well as for us as a space to sort of figure out how do we support him in trying to think through this. And it's not that neat, but there are really beautiful moments, and I think one of them was that, and like we've been asking a lot of these women throughout Nepal, like, did you ever see a man with a tattoo? Because in India, there's certain reports. In Nepal, there's no image at all in historical, like, in Nepal, anthropologists kind of came around the 1960s and 70s, so we kind of were introduced to them a bit later, but like they did a lot of work across the country. And when we're looking at their works, there are no images of men with tattoos, but when you talk to villagers, we heard examples, for example, in the instance where, this is where like, I used to work in hospitals before I was working in art, and then I used to study sickle cell disease, which is a genetic blood disorder that leads to pain all over the body. And the way I got introduced into tattooing was a lot of the people I was speaking to had tattoos on different parts of their bodies, including men. And these are often like little dots or lines or crosses. And when I asked them, they were like, oh, it's used to heal pain on a specific part of the body. So tattooing across South Asia, not just in Nepal, is used to actually visualize pain. And often the ingredients used for healing tattoo are different. So in this process of interviewing these women, we realized in this part of Nepal, like dried anchovies, I guess similar to ikan bilis, is like roasted and ground up and mixed into the tattoo ink in order to like make the ink for healing. And that is a very specific ink that's just used for healing. That's not used in the case if you're trying to make like images. And this conversation would have never happened were we not like, you know, to create the space and be like, okay. And Lovekant sort of went and was like, my thumb is hurting. Can you make like a, you know, a mark to sort of heal it? And then the woman sort of went and like was like, oh, I need fish. Go get fish. And then he's like, why do you need fish? And then she's like, oh, it's a part of the ingredient. And then there was this another moment that was really beautiful where we were asking about tattooing on men. And then there's this, she's not pictured here, but there's this elderly woman from the village of Dang. Her name is Baraya Tharuni. She's probably in her 90s now. And she's a very like, in this valley, if you go and if you ask many villagers or like, who do you know who's tattooed, then her name kept on popping up. And you go, and whenever we'd asked her directly, oh, did you ever seen tattoos on men? She would always say no. And then after Lovekant got his tattoo on his leg and he sort of went there, and I was also there. And then he was just showing his leg tattoo, and he was like, "Oh, what do you think of it?" And then she was like, "Oh, now you look like a woman." But then after that, then he also asked like, "Oh, have you ever seen another man with a tattoo?" And then she just thought for a second, and then she put her hand on her chest and was like, "Yeah, my uncle had 2 peacocks on his chest." And then, but this is sort of like, you know, there's no account of this ever being written or documented, and it's like you hear from like what's probably the, you know, the veritable source of tattooing in Western Nepal saying her uncle has it, and she remembers him receiving it from like a nearby village, and her remembering like men having tattoos in that sense. And whenever we asked her a direct question, she would always say no, but like when she saw an image of a horse on a man, then she's like, "Oh wait, yeah, I've seen peacocks on men before too." So that was quite special. And then Lavkan jokingly asked like, "Oh, what would you call a man who tattoos?" And then she just thought about it. And in this language, you have a formal name for women who tattoo in the Tharu language, which is tikinya. That word kept on appearing in the village, and she's like, "Oh, probably if a man tattooed, I would call him tikarwa." And then she sort of gave Lavkant a word to call himself, which he didn't have before. So yeah, so now he uses the word tikarwa to refer to like male tattoo artists. And that is quite special too. So I think in this sense, I think it's a journey and a process of sort of creating spaces where you have familiarity, but also this relationship with these artists that allow for these new experimentations to emerge and continue. Yeah, that's sort of the only way I'd sort of been able to navigate that or see that unfold as we work in Nepal.
Hi, thanks for sharing about the work that the collective does. My question is very much about where you see the work of the collective going. I think the act of archiving is very much about documenting the past into the future, right? So I'm curious about what you see the works that you have shared contributing, or what its relevance or significance will be, 10, 20 years from now.
I think one of the basic things that we've been always sort of talking about is having this accessibility to archive, and how do we create that? Because a lot of the archive that we're working with is are mostly the personal archives that are with the artist or the artist family, and like a lot of people do not have access to it. And we started this compiling all these things together in one place, and then there are already like a couple of researchers and people who are approaching and also working with the archive in their research, and that's also like thinking us like about how do we create that accessibility. We've been talking a lot about having a system where we can have all of these online, and then have all of this in place where people don't have to they can access it freely in their own space. But then that will take I think more longer time because it requires a lot of resources, right? And that's something. And I think the other thing that we've been working with is also looking at how do we activate all these archives. Because we're also looking through exhibition making, publication, or even like the thing we did with a symposium, like how do we activate all these archives through conversations, and invite people to experience or like engage with the archive. We do, I think one of the work, interestingly, one of the really good engagement with the Lansing Bangdal archive came out last year was with a designer that we were working with to create this visual identity for the archive. And the way he was engaging with the archive to create all these visual languages was quite interesting, trying to trace his handwritings through his writings, trying to replicate many different stamps and other things. Yeah, I think, and those are the sort of engagements that's been happening, and we're sort of more interested in towards, and other things are like exhibition making and publications.
Yeah, and I think related to like a recent symposium we did, what's particularly interesting of what's happening in Kathmandu right now is that we're one of a series of independent archives that have emerged in the past 10 years. So we're like the visual arts one, and there's like another group called Nepal Music Archive that's been documenting like recording of Nepali music starting in like the 19th century and trying to see how that's going. There's another group called Nepal Picture Library that's been documenting a lot of like studio photography and how photographs have, as a medium but also as an object of circulation sort of emerge in Nepal. There's another group, Kathmandu Institute, that's documenting like modernist building and constructions and sort of city planning across the country. And yeah, and there's also regional groups in like Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Bihar, that also borders Nepal, that are also thinking through about similar like issues. In our case, we've recently started, but we're talking a lot with archives that have similar challenges and also are looking at a similar time period, but through different medium. And I think it's only been like the last year or so that we've all been talking to each other and trying to figure out, okay, like in the absence of sort of like state entities or larger institutions trying to, or even universities dealing with all of this in Nepal. So there's no larger sort of space trying to document or contextualize this history. All of these independent spaces that are sort of emerged, we're kind of talking to each other to figure out, okay, how do you sort of resource pool? How do we think about like how we want to present this in the future? Is there ways we can collaborate? Because we also realize that the visual art one is like one section of like a much larger history of this time period. And it'll be really interesting, at least for us, to speak with all of these archivists and spaces to figure out if we can do something together potentially in the future. And there does seem to be interest, but again, yeah, it takes time. And we're all very small teams, and we kind of need to be respectful of people's times and efforts and energies to try to put this together. But this is a conversation we'd like to have. And often in Nepal, we kind of feel like we're behind everyone else, like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, because like they just started on this bandwagon much earlier than us. But then we also realize we can do things a little bit differently than them, and we don't necessarily need to follow the same blueprint. So it'll be interesting where it goes. But yeah, there's no clear answer. But I guess a part of it is like we've started the conversation for perhaps an answer to emerge for that. Yeah.
We'll take one last question.
Thank you for very interesting presentation. I am Nepal ambassador to Malaysia. So I got I understood that what they have presented, and then particularly the first part, the art in the book, and then many of them the book I also read. Okay, in my due course of my time. So I can relate that. And also the second part, the tattooing, it is also very interesting. I am grown up in the community called Chaudhary, like the Tharu, no? And then same kind of the cultures they have. And then I see there the men as well tattooing at that time. It is a different place that they are making a collection. But I come from the similar community, not belong to that communities, but we live together at that time. The third one is the migrations. No? Migration, since I am Nepali ambassador, there are many reflections coming in the archive, the collective they are making in relating to the migration. Thank you very much indeed. And then I have my queries, the queries, did you have a chance to speak the young generations? And then whether they continue to carry some traditions of their own identity, of their community, through the various mechanisms that you are explaining, okay? And linking with this, is there some mechanism exist in the local institution like Bahadur or the local institutions? Did you also have a chance to reflect on that during your collection? Thank you. Did you get my point?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think like according to Nepal's, like, I don't know. In Nepal, it's very funny. They're politicians in their like mid-40s and they're still considered young politicians. So I think like in that sense, everyone on the team is young, but like, but yeah. And they're all, but what's been very encouraging is like, these are all like sort of a younger generation of artists, almost everyone on the team who's trying to think about how do we take responsibility for our histories and practices, but how do we also frame it from the communities in which, like, a lot of the artists come from themselves. So, like in Hitman's case, he's talking about migration of Gurung peoples, and he comes from the same community. Lavkant is a Tharu artist from Sarlai, and he's thinking about what this means for his community. Indu is a Tharu artist from Kailali, and she's thinking a lot about, you know, what this means for our community. And a lot of young artists come to our space often as like a resource, either for like you know, reading resources, to find some type of mentorship at times, but also to think about, okay, I have this idea, is there a certain direction we can take it? We're slowly building up more towards like a more open library space, and also perhaps a residency format, and also some open calls to sort of have, you know, workshops and other opportunities for younger artists, and we're slowly developing that. But yeah, there are a lot of young people who come to our office. In terms of like engaging with sort of what are customary spaces for, I guess, knowledge production and cultural transmission, including what you mentioned as the Badghar system. These are sort of the traditional, like, chieftain systems in Nepali villages, where you have village chiefs who are almost like democratically elected through like village means, and who sit and run the affairs. What's really interesting is that we never like directly approach them, but for Indoji, she's gotten requests from many like village chiefs after this project to come and speak about this, or they're like, we want a tattoo project in our village, can you come? Or like, what did you do there, can we start? Or do you know anyone who makes tattoos, we're interested. So that conversation is beginning, and I think the artists are now trying to figure out, okay, how do we sort of leverage this? And also not just the customary system, but local governments in Nepal. So for example, the Rajapur municipality, Barabadia municipality, these are municipalities in this particular part of Nepal. Yeah, Saura, yeah, we're trying to do another launch. So most of what you saw here is from the western half of Nepal. We're trying to do another edition sort of in the eastern half. And this kind of it's really fun because Lavkant, the artist who we work with, is kind of thinking it through, like, the other people who make a lot of tattoos across South Asia are either Banjara communities who used to migrate between different spaces, so also India and Nepal. But the other one is also in Melas, so these traditional carnivals used to have traveling tattoo artists who used to go and make tattoos. So he sort of decided that this event should not happen at the same place with the theme that it should travel in itself. So another iteration we're thinking of in Eastern Nepal to kind of have that conversation there again. But yeah, so he's going around speaking to artists there, and yeah. So we'll see how that unfolds, but yeah.
On behalf of Ilham, I'd like to thank you very much, Priyankar and Bishal, and can all join. And thank you all for joining for this event. Thank you.